What's up, everybody? My name is Ryan Turford, the man on the moose, and welcome to Greatness Begins, the PlayStation 1 show where I tell you about all my favorite PlayStation 1 games of all time. So, folks at home, if you're watching on youtube.com/carpoolgaming, don't forget to hit like on the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. And of course, ding, 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 ring that bell to get notifications on all of our newest videos. Also, if you want the audio version of this show a little bit earlier, head over to Patreon, patreon.com/carpoolgaming. We also have some exclusive content over there. That's pretty awesome as well. So you can definitely check us out over there. Or if you're listening to us on the PlayStation Drive on audio feeds, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or whatever, don't forget to hit the subscribe button there as well as, leave us a rating if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. But today, friends, I'm very excited because, I talked about this a couple weeks ago with the Fear Effect episode, and y'all probably know this from hearing me talk about these types of games all the time, but I love horror games. It's one of my favorite genres in games. I just love kind of what the spooky element does to the gameplay of a lot of different games, and I just love going around and exploring, creepy environments. I think that stuff is super cool, especially because I love horror movies. I wasn't always that way because, I definitely got much more into horror movies, after I went to college for the first time, and then as I became an adult, I really just was consuming horror much, much more going forward. So it's definitely it's more of a modern thing for me personally to be into horror. And today's game, if you want a horror game to talk about, if you want a game that was probably one of the most influential games on the PlayStation 1, that's today's game. And the reason why it's just a little bit lower on my list is because in a lot of ways we have a superior version of today's game, which of course is Resident Evil. I don't know why I held that up so awkwardly, but that's just how we're doing it. But because we do have the GameCube version of Resident Evil, which is definitely where I would recommend anyone who's new to Resident Evil to try this one and play it there. Or if you have a modern console like a PlayStation 4 or PlayStation 5, to just pick it up on PSN as well, because that's the same version as the GameCube version. And that's the version I recommend everyone play. But again, it would be impossible for me to do a list like this and omit such a renowned game as Resident Evil, especially because, again, just how it influenced the horror genre and just how many, Resident Evil copies we kind of had after this game came out. So it was a highly influential game on the PlayStation 1, but it's just the PlayStation 1 version is a little bit harder to go back to, which is why, again, I recommend, playing a modern version. But if you've never played the original Resident Evil before, it's a must-play game if you like horror games. I think it's definitely one of those games, too, that teaches you a lot about game design, if you want to learn about how games are made and whatnot, as well as just, excellence in game design in general. I think that it's a masterpiece of a game, regardless of where you play it. Although, again, there's some silly things with the PlayStation 1 version that we'll kind of talk about. But for the most part, I think it's an incredible game. So Resident Evil, of course, came out on March 30th, 1996 here in North America. And it was developed by Capcom. And it was also directed by Shinji Mikami, who you might know nowadays for being the director on games like The Evil Within, as well as Ghostwire Tokyo over at Tango Gameworks. But he started off at Capcom making Disney games, which was actually kind of hilarious if you look back at his history. He also worked on a quiz game as well, that was Japan only. But he worked on the Game Boy version of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, as well as Aladdin on the SNES, as well as Goof Troop. He directed both those games, and both those games are awesome Disney games as well. Goof Troop, it's one of those things where I don't like Goof Troop at all, whether it's the TV show or the movie. But man, that Goof Troop game is actually pretty fun. And Aladdin as well. One of the better versions of Aladdin for sure. I'm still more partial to the Genesis version of Aladdin, if you want to know what side of the fence I am with that one. But I think the Super Nintendo version is really good. And then Who Framed Roger Rabbit, that was really bad on the NES, but the Game Boy version is a little bit better. So, it's kind of crazy kind of seeing Mikami-san's kind of journey going from, working on Disney games to working on Resident Evil, one of the key horror franchises at the time, because development on this really started in 1993. And this was kind of coming off, basically Mikami-san was working on a racing game at the time, but that project basically got canceled, and he was basically approached by someone at Capcom who wanted him to lead their new horror project that basically it's cited in a bunch of articles, but I know that we don't have concrete proof that it was trying to be a remake of the NES game that was Japan only called Sweet Home, which was one of the very first, one of the very first horror games on consoles anyways, or definitely one of the first well-known. We had horror games on the Atari 2600, but they weren't the same as Sweet Home, which was, similar to Resident Evil in style, where you're exploring this big mansion and you're looking for stuff. And likewise, Resident Evil wasn't the first, survival horror game, even because we had stuff like Alone in the Dark before this one and whatnot. But Mikami-san was kind of approached to do this because of a couple reasons. Number one, Mikami was kind of like a bit of a scaredy cat. He didn't really love, he got scared very easily. And so he didn't really, he liked horror movies, but he wasn't like gravitating towards the horror genre because he was very much like, kind of like a scaredy cat, but that was the type of person they were looking for. They were looking for someone who could direct, a quality game, but would also, feel some of the scares when it got scary anyway. So that's kind of why Mikami got approached after, doing Disney games to work on something like Resident Evil, which I think is just a pretty cool story, knowing what's going on there. And as well, like Mikami-san had talked about, in interviews as well, about when talking about the development of Resident Evil, about how, he had seen some Italian zombie films in the past and been kind of like let down by them but was like really kind of like drawn in by the Romero trilogy of zombie films. So Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and then Day of the Dead. So even though, again, he was a bit of a scaredy cat, he still really appreciated those films. So that was one of the other things that kind of drew him to the project, because he basically wanted to try and create a game that had the scary elements, that wasn't a letdown like some of the other films that he kind of grew up with, some of the zombie films that he kind of grew up with. So again, it took about 3 years to develop Resident Evil. Like I said, it came out in 96. Development started in 93. And it originally came out in Japan as Biohazard. The reason it's named Resident Evil is this was actually a suggestion by Capcom USA's localization team when this was basically coming over from Japan, essentially when the localization was starting on it, where, they're basically, going into this house. It's spooky. And, I don't know how they kind of tied that to, being a resident and it being evil, but sure, that's just kind of the suggestion that Capcom USA floated with, and Capcom Japan said, yeah, sure, we'll call it there. That it sounds pretty good. It made more, and I think with the name Biohazard, it would have been probably a little more forgetful because Biohazard in North America would probably just be a little more of a generic term, anyways. Especially because we had other, bio stuff coming out around this time. We had, Biomutants and stuff like that too. So I think that, it stands out a lot more with the name Resident Evil. Even though it doesn't make a lot of sense, it still makes more sense anyways that the name itself is Resident Evil, and it just definitely stands out more. So again, when this game came out, it was huge. I remember, reading magazines and stuff at the time. I was still primarily a PC player at the time that this came out, but I mean, you'd have to be living under a rock if you didn't hear about Resident Evil, and people just loving this game or talking about it all the time, or again, reading about it in magazines. Because again, this was before you could read everything on the internet, and just lots of chatter about this game. A lot of people were really excited about this one and were really happy with it after it came out. So again, the launch of Resident Evil 1 was huge, and it just, again, inspired a whole other genre of games, essentially. Because like I said, even though we had survival horror games before, it was really the very first Resident Evil that popularized survival horror games and kind of made it a genre that, people looked forward to new entries in. And it was really cool to kind of see that. Now, as you probably noticed, if you're watching the video version of this, there's actually 3 different versions of the original Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1. And they have slight tweaks and differences between the 3 of them. So first off, you just have the base Resident Evil that came out. It came out originally in a long box because it also came out on Sega Saturn as well around the same time. But basically that version of the game is just the basic version of Resident Evil. And then right here I've got the director's cut. What they did with this one is they basically left the original game alone if you just want to play the original game with no changes. But then they also added an arrange mode, which basically almost is like the Zelda Master Quest, where it's the same, mansion map, but all of the items you need to pick up, as well as all of the zombies, are in completely different areas. So as you explore, you're not gonna be able to, like, all the keys are in different areas, all the zombie placements are completely different. So it almost feels like playing a different game, even though you're playing it in the same area. Again, it feels very similar to if you've played, the Ocarina of Time Master Quest on the GameCube or something along those lines. And then they also have a greatest hits version of this director's cut as well, which adds DualShock support as well. And why would Capcom do this with, like, make 3 different versions of the same game? Like, why did it make sense to do so? Well, basically Resident Evil 2 was coming out, and you'll notice as well, if you're watching the video version of the show, this version actually includes a demo for Resident Evil 2. But Resident Evil 2 got delayed quite a few times, and the development was kind of like all over the place with that game. Again, we'll talk about that one in the future. But I think the development was kind of all over the place, and fans were eagerly awaiting, the next Resident Evil game, and Capcom wanted to, satiate the fans. So that's why they put out this version of the game, the director's cut, to basically give players a new way to play it. Also, this is a good version for beginners as well, because it does have a beginner mode, which is essentially an easy mode for the game, just giving you extra ammo, and then basically just making it easier to kill the zombies as well. And then there's also the greatest hits version has DualShock support, so it's the same as this one, but it's got DualShock support. Also, this game has very famously bad FMV cutscenes, which, of course, me, I love Sega CD games. I love FMV games, especially the cheesier, the better. So I love the FMV cutscenes that are in this game. The FMV intro is amazing.
Joseph! No! Don't go!
But in North America, that was actually censored. It was censored in all versions except for the director's cut version with the DualShock support. So they had originally advertised that this one was going to have uncensored cinematics, but this one is actually censored as well. And it's actually only the greatest hits one, which, again, is kind of like the definitive version of Resident Evil on PlayStation 1, the greatest hits director's cut version specifically, because then you got the DualShock support, the uncensored cutscenes, but then all the same stuff that they added in this version, essentially. So, but yeah, if you're going to play Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1, pick up one of the director's cut versions. It's definitely well worth it. But otherwise, again, gameplay, it's typical Resident Evil fare. You've got tank controls in this one. You're going around, trying to not get eaten by zombies, kind of trying to conserve your ammo a little bit. Also, there's a thing that happens later in the game that almost punishes you for killing everything. So you don't want to necessarily kill any zombies that you don't have to, or that you're not, finding yourself kind of in life and death situations. In a way, it kind of reminded me of other Capcom games like Mega Man, for example, because I know when a lot of people, play Mega Man for the first time, they might feel the urge to kill every single enemy in the game. But ultimately, with Mega Man, what you're trying to do is kind of get through the environments as quickly as possible, and you're really trying to only kill the enemies that are kind of necessary in order to kind of get through it, because that way you'll minimize damage. And because sometimes it's even better to take a hit instead of, fighting an enemy for a prolonged period of time and then getting hit multiple times, because at that point you should have just ran through them and taken the one hit that you would have needed in order to get through them. And Resident Evil kind of plays the same way, where, there's a hallway full of zombies. There might be one that you need to take out on one side before kind of running through them. But for the most part, you want to just kind of dodge and weave through the enemies whenever possible and not try and, murder everything on screen, because the game kind of punishes you for that, whether it's lack of ammo or, again, the thing that happens later in the game that, again, I'm not going to spoil for anyone who's never played it before. So the gameplay itself is really fun, but this is a PlayStation 1 game, and trying to play with the tank controls without the DualShock support is not as fun. So it's definitely a little bit tougher to play the game with the D-pad as opposed to having full analog support. And even then, the full analog support still doesn't, again, like modernize the controls in the way that the GameCube version does. That's why I think the GameCube remake of Resident Evil is like a perfect game. Like, there's no reason why you would probably want anything new, unless you wanted to maybe turn that into like a third person shooter, like over the shoulder game, kind of like Resident Evil 2 remake or something like that, which I think would be interesting. I would love to maybe see them do that with Resident Evil 1 one day. But for the most part, I think the tank controls totally work if the control scheme works along with it. And definitely either the normal director's cut or the original version, the controls definitely fall short. And they do that kind of to amp up the scares. So I can understand the design philosophy behind that, but it still doesn't make it a very fun game to play. Whereas I love the balance when a game can strike the balance of being both fun and scary at the same time. And definitely original Resident Evil doesn't do that, but Resident Evil 1 on the GameCube or modern consoles does. Which is why, again, it's an important game to have on here. Again, I think it was a really big influence on the PlayStation 1 in general. And again, just one of the standout games on the PlayStation 1 that every person, I think, who's interested in horror games owes it to themselves to at least play at some point. Even if you don't finish it, you should at least play Resident Evil 1, regardless of how you get your hands on it, because I think it's well worth the play and the purchase. But you don't need me to tell you that. You probably already know that even if you're watching this video or listening on podcast feeds, because there's a reason why this turned into a giant franchise with multiple films and comics and all kinds of lore outside the games and just bajillions of sequels, because the first one was so good that it definitely warranted it. And again, it's an absolute classic on the PlayStation 1 and had to be included on this list, or I would just be, I would be kind of silly on this end. But anyways, what do you think about Resident Evil 1 on PlayStation 1? Let me know in the comments below what you think. Also, let me know what you think about the list so far. Have I gotten anything wrong? Have I gotten anything right? What games are you looking forward to me talking about in the future? I'd love to hear from you. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming, on YouTube at youtube.com/Carpool Gaming, and on podcast services around the globe. So that's it for this episode of Greatness Begins. My name is Ryan Turford once again, and we're out.